Hello, I'm Esther Gitu. It's Friday, June 16th. This is Africa 54. African leaders arrive in Kyiv to begin a peace mission hoping to mediate between Ukraine and Russia. A U.S. State Department report on human trafficking says camps that entrap boys and young men into forced labor are on the rise. An award-winning Comorian singer, songwriter and guitarist Othman Mohamed Elias, better known as Marlesh, performs his biggest hit, Wasi Wasi. All this and much more coming up on today's Africa 54. An air raid alert was issued in the Ukrainian capital Kyiv and the Kyiv region on Friday as presidents from several African countries arrived for a two-day mission to mediate between Ukraine and Russia. Paul Ndiho has more.
The delegation of African presidents and senior officials participating in the African Leaders Peace Mission includes South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, Senegalese President Macky Sall, Zambia's President Hakainde Hichilema, Egypt's Prime Minister Mustafa Madbule, and Uganda's former Prime Minister Ruhakana Rugunda. On Friday, they visited St. Andrew's Orthodox Church in the city of Bucha. Ukraine says Russian occupiers carried out executions, rapes and torture in Bucha, where the international investigators have collected evidence of war crimes. Russia denies the allegations. The high-profile diplomatic team hopes to bring to the table the voice of a continent badly hit by rising grain prices and broader impact on global trade since Russia invaded Ukraine. According to a draft framework document seen by the media, the delegation is likely to propose a series of confidence-building measures in Ukraine during initial efforts at mediation. The document says the mission aims to promote and encourage the parties to agree to a diplomacy-led process. Those measures could include a pullback of Russian troops, removal of Russian tactical nuclear weapons from Belarus, suspension of implementing an international criminal arrest warrant targeting Putin, and relief from the Western sanctions imposed on Russia. The document stated that an agreement on cessation of hostilities could follow and would need to be accompanied by negotiations between Russia and the West. Kyiv says its peace initiative, which envisages the withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukrainian land, must be the basis of any war settlement. Paul Ndiho, VOA News, Washington.
So what can the Africa Peace Mission to Russia and Ukraine actually accomplish? That was the focus of the discussion this week. On VOA's discussion program, Straight Talk Africa, host Heidi Adams spoke to former U.S. Special Envoy for the Sahel region, J. Peter Pham, and political analyst Renee Lake about it.
What do you make of this peace mission to Russia and Ukraine? I mean, what's the best that can be hoped for here?
Well, one always, as a diplomat, one always favors talks and communication. But let's be very honest, Haiti. This so-called peace mission of African leaders has no credibility. It is at best an exercise in theatrics, a little too late, I think, for some of the issues we'll talk about with South Africa. But it's no credit. In order to be a peacemaker, one has to be an honest broker. And these are not honest brokers going to a situation to break routine. You've got South Africa, and we can get into all the letters from the members of Congress and other actions, but certainly not a neutral player in this, holding exercises with the Russian military on the anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine. You've got President Museveni of Uganda, whose son and presumptive heir publicly declared himself, "Call me a Putinist." And you have others with Egypt, which was discovered to have been trying to manufacture 40,000 rockets for Russia. So these aren't honest brokers. The Ukrainians will certainly receive them, but I don't expect much out of this.
The Africans would argue, of course, that they have a lot at stake and they want to be part of the conversation. Rene, what's your take? I mean, why is this mission happening now, and why these 6 African countries?
Yeah, it's very interesting what the ambassador was saying, because in general, historically that's been my kind of a position with a lot of those African initiatives in Middle East and other things. Very often is more like some kind of marketing and some kind of communication for internal purpose, by the way, from those head of states. But for once, I'm not going to say this is a credible mission. I'm not going to go as far as that, but I'm going to say there is some good reason for both parties to listen to them, and mainly for the most important party, which is basically Russia, because as an invader. Because if you look at the 5 key votes done at the UN, globally, if you take especially like the last one, which was about paying reparation to Russian paying reparation to Ukraine, half of the African country abstained to that vote. So, and I think it's the only region on the planet where you have so many countries abstaining. This is again like a resurrection of most of the non-aligned movement of the Cold War time. So that gives them some kind of leverage, quote unquote, with Russia, because just as the ambassador just mentioning, the fact that they that close to Russia and they have not unconditional support of Russia, that could give them some kind of leverage and saying, listen, today Russia is very aggressive on the African continent, is getting involved from an investment, from a security standpoint, a lot in Africa. Is in your interest to not let the African continent down the way you have done with this whole adventure. So I think that you can, but to go there and think that they can at least broke a ceasefire, I doubt, but who knows? I'm trying to be optimistic.
That was former U.S. Special Envoy for the Sahel region, J. Peter Pham, and political analyst Rene Lake speaking to host Heidi Adams on Straight Talk Africa. For more perspective on the African Peace Mission to Kyiv and Moscow, I'm joined live via Skype from Washington, D.C. by Kwaku Nuama, a professor of international politics at American University. Professor Nuama, welcome to Africa 54.
Thanks for having me, Esther.
Well, now they are in Kyiv. Tell me, what's the significance of their trip to that city and the one that's going to follow in Moscow?
Well, I think that the trip showcases Africa's commitment to peace. I generally agree with Peter Pham's analysis that the African team really doesn't have, they don't have what it takes to make peace because they're not honest brokers. And I think that's a big problem, that you got to have leverage to make peace, to get parties to start talking. Parties don't change their behavior simply because you're asking them to. And this African team doesn't have the leverage to get anybody to take them seriously.
You probably heard what J. Peter Pham had to say about the South Africa's president and President Museveni of Uganda. But what's really in these talks for the continent?
So the continent is trying to get the parties to start talking peace. But beyond that, they are also trying to get a commitment to the Black Sea grain deal, which Africa needs. They're trying to get a fertilizer deal and a grain deal as well. But also, if you notice that the two of the leaders on this trip, Cyril Ramaphosa and Macky Sall, have serious domestic political problems. And this trip can help divert some of the attentions, negative attentions back home, and help particularly Macky Sall, who is rumored to be seeking a third term in Senegal. This might help him personally. But beyond that, I think that African leaders tend to overestimate their capacity to shape world events. And we're seeing that they've taken this trip. Personally, I think that I'm hoping that whilst they are there, particularly whilst they are in Ukraine, they educate themselves about the effects of this war. So I'm glad that they went to Bucha, for example. They can see what has happened on the ground. And even whilst they were in Kyiv, we saw them sheltering from Russian missiles coming in. And so whilst they're on the ground, hopefully they learn something about the dynamics of the conflict and they modify their behavior accordingly.
Wow, it was a scary moment. But then what's the strategy now for this African delegation and what can they achieve?
So the draft framework that has been kind of previewed in the media has a simple strategy: get the Russians to pull back troops and get them to remove tactical weapons from Belarus in exchange for sanctions relief, including a suspension of the ICC's arrest warrant for Putin. But they're not going to be able to do any of these things, as I said, because they lack the leverage and they cannot surmount the preconditions that the Ukrainians are putting forward, which is a total withdrawal of Russian troops. And it's not even clear that the Russians themselves are also even going to take the African efforts seriously. So I think that in the end, they may come away with a deal on the grain export, but I don't see them moving any of the dynamics that's needed to get the parties to talk serious, because you need leverage for that. And African leaders have very little leverage. Even the little one that they have, they've misused it by coming up publicly on the side of the Russians. So the Ukrainians really have no reason to trust them. And I think that this is going to be as a trip for photos and stuff like that.
Professor, thank you very much for your perspective. Kwaku Nuama is a professor of international politics at American University. The U.S. State Department has released its annual report on human trafficking. Among some of its findings, online scams that entrap people into forced labor are on the rise, and boys and young men face an increased risk of being trafficked. VOA's Veronica Balderas Iglesias reports.
As human trafficking expands worldwide, more than 27 million people are being denied autonomy over their own life and actions, said U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken as he released the 2023 Trafficking in Persons report.
The rise in labor trafficking using online scams, which have proliferated as more of the world gains access to the internet. The pandemic supercharged this trend. Traffickers capitalized on widespread unemployment to recruit victims with fake job listings and then force them to run international scams.
Blinken also described male victims as an overlooked segment of trafficking.
Now, for years, there's been a widely held but incorrect belief that trafficking affects exclusively female victims. This false perception has had some, quite frankly, devastating and tangible consequences, with far fewer support services typically allocated to male victims of trafficking. The reality is that any person, regardless of sex, regardless of gender identity, can be targeted by human traffickers.
At an event in Washington on Thursday, several individuals were recognized for their efforts to combat human trafficking. Cindy Dyer, the ambassador at large to monitor and combat trafficking in persons, emphasized the United States' commitment to ending the practice.
Regularly bringing together 20 agencies to review and refine our federal anti-trafficking strategies. We are incorporating recommendations of survivors into our policymaking and programs. We are partnering with neighboring countries to reduce the risk of migrants falling prey to human traffickers. And we are championing partnerships with technology companies and financial institutions to better prosecute traffickers.
Honored at the event was R. Yvonne Benson Idahosa, an advocate who studies and fights sex trafficking in Nigeria. She called for those in power to do more.
To world leaders who have the power to disrupt trafficking, systemic failures of national and international governments that prioritize profit over people and arbitrary rules over good conscience can no longer be countenanced.
The 2023 report assesses the efforts of 188 countries and territories to combat human trafficking. Veronica Valderas Iglesias, VOA News, Washington.
On Friday, young people across South Africa will commemorate Youth Day. Tuso Kumalo has more from Johannesburg.
The youth behind me here and their parents came all the way from across Johannesburg to the Hector Peterson Memorial Center here in Soweto to reflect on the events of 1976, where young people went out to the streets protesting against the Bantu education, which made them only good enough to be servants of those that colonized them at the time. And of course, the introduction of the colonizers' language in schools as the medium of instruction. But today they are facing a multiple of new problems, and they are blaming the democratic government for it. There is high unemployment, high drug abuse, high teenage pregnancy, and these youths are saying they want government to bring solutions and bring them now.
We need jobs. It is a must. We need jobs. We need to be balanced in the economy. We need to balance the economy and bring the economy up. So we really need jobs.
It is not even recognizing us. It's like to them, we are nothing but tools for their own power. They seek power that it should be our own power to control, but they seek to control us.
I feel like schools should teach us how to be responsible, how to grow each other, instead of feeding us with knowledge that's just going to be stuck in our heads and it won't be useful because there are less jobs now.
In his address to the main gathering that was held in Free State, Deputy President Paul Mashatile promised the young people that the government was hard at work to try and create employment and of course create conditions that will make them excel in life. Whether that plan is only on paper or it will be implemented practically, only time will tell. Tuso Kumalo for VOA News in Johannesburg.
June 17 has been declared by the UN General Assembly as World Day to combat desertification and drought. The theme of this year's global observance, led by the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, UNCCD, is Her Land, Her Rights. VOA's Lenomu Du spoke in an exclusive interview with Ibrahim Thiaw, Under Secretary General and Executive Secretary, UNCCD. Here's an excerpt.
Only 15% of agricultural land is registered for women in the world, whereas they are actually 45% of the workforce. The reason why we are addressing this issue at the UN Desertification and Drought Day is precisely to put a spotlight on this issue, in addition to being not just, but it is not the right path that we need to take if we are to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Essentially, there are very few laws, written laws, against women's land rights, but there are a lot of customary laws, a lot of traditions that go against the equality that we are all aspiring at in terms of women's access to land. We need more policies to change the situation. The narrative that we talked about is again coming from sometimes from customary laws, sometimes from traditions, sometimes wrongly, sometimes attributed to religions. But all of that needs to change, and it will change through regulations. It will change through incentives that can be put in place. It can change through programs, specific programs targeting women's access to land. It can change through land restoration programs. When land is degraded and being put back to health, it can be targeted for specific groups to benefit from. And there are multiple initiatives that can be promoted by countries without necessarily creating the revolutions that everybody, many people will be concerned about, but actually to change these laws and to create incentives for this situation to change.
That was Ibrahim Thiaw, Under Secretary General and Executive Secretary, UNCCD, speaking to VOA's Lenomu Du. The Global African Leadership Summit is a U.S.-based summit that focuses on celebrating African achievements, culture, and music. This year, the summit will celebrate its 55th anniversary. And for more on what's lined up for the October summit, I'm joined by Marco Leroc, founder of the Global African Leadership Summit. Marco, welcome to Africa 54.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me on the show. It is a pleasure.
Now, it's been 5 years since you set up this first global U.S. summit. Have you achieved the goals you set out to achieve?
Yeah, so the goal is in progress. For anything that you do, has to be, you can never achieve a specific goal. That's very tangible. So the goal is in progress. So our goal here, is to make sure that we connect young professional African leaders and entrepreneurs that live in the diaspora, and then we engage them We understand that there's so many thriving entrepreneurs right now that live in the diaspora, and we need to make sure that we stay connected, that we support each other, because one thing that you have to realize is that we need to do business between each others. So that's the goal of this event, to make sure that there's that interaction. So that's one. Secondly, how do you make sure that we have economic prosperity for African of the diaspora, but also African descent? Because once we prosper economically, we can make a greater impact back home.
Now, I'm just wondering, because different Africans here in the U.S. come with different uniques because of the countries they come from, the cultures and all of that. How do you tap into those different talents when you come to meet, and how do you collaborate? Yeah,
so that's pretty simple, because once you realize that when people come to these summits, people have a different goals, because we have a different topics. So, for instance, we're going to have business expo. So that gives the ability of the entrepreneurs, because you ask people who are seasonal entrepreneurs, they still work their 9-to-5 job, but they still have something on the side. So that gives them the opportunity, to showcase their businesses. That's one. And then people who have certain skills, they can showcase also their talent there. So that's one piece of the business of the business expo. And then also we're gonna have a career fair. You can have different organizations that live in DC, for instance, that gonna be here at this, at this event for people, students who are looking for job, international organizations to have that opportunity. So that's second. We're gonna have different workshops. A workshop, for instance, what is strategy to create wealth today, not yesterday, right? So we can learn those different strategies. Money management tips. We live in a society right now where we cripple with stress and depression, all those stuff. We're gonna talk about that, because sometimes it's hard for us, people of color, where we come from, to talk about mental health issue, because people think you're crazy. Also, the society that we live in, it's not that. So we need to talk more about those subjects. Yeah. We're gonna have live podcasts. So it's going to be very interactive event, for us. So let's go to what you're planning for this October. I know you have the event coming up on the 27th, 28th of October. Is that correct? And you bring in a lot of talents and a lot of people, not just Africans, but also Americans and other people. Correct. What's planned? Yeah, so that's what I was narrating earlier. So we're going to have a business expo. We're going to have a career fair. We're going to have different workshops. We're going to have a workshop on wealth management strategy, money management, how to build your business, live podcast, but also we're gonna have an award ceremony. As you mentioned, we have so many talents, and we need to recognize those talents in different categories as far as leadership, entrepreneurship, and community involvement. I can tell you we'll be there to cover that event. It's coming here in DC. Thank you very much, Marco. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. Marco Lerock is the founder of the Global African Leadership Summit. Still to come, award-winning Comorian singer, songwriter, and guitarist Othman Mohamed Elias performs his biggest hit, Wasi Wasi. Stay with us.
You're watching VOA's Red Carpet. My name is Jackson Vunganyi. Thank you so much for joining us each week right here on Red Carpet. We bring you the latest in
In other news, Malians will vote on Sunday to approve or reject constitutional amendments that would reinforce presidential powers ahead of a promised transition from military rule back to democracy in the West African nation. The referendum is the first in a series of scheduled polls that are meant to pave the way for the presidential elections in 2024. And in our entertainment segment, award-winning Comorian singer, songwriter, and guitarist Othman Mohamed Elias, better known as Maaleshi, talks with Heather Maxwell via Skype about his decades-long career and performs his biggest hit, Wasi Wasi. Let's see.
All right, now it is time to meet my special guest, Malesh. He is a multi-award-winning, international renowned musician, decades in the business, and an activist known for promoting tolerance, peace, freedom. Welcome to the program, Malesh. Well, I want the world who don't know you to get to know you a little bit. So first of all, let's start with your name, Malesh. That is a stage name. What is your birth name?
Muhammad Elias Othman.
And how did you come by Malesh? What does that mean?
Malesh, it's an Arabic word which means, I mean that no problem, as it's a peace word. Mola tusame naomba wana wote wa duniani tushikane.
Now, you've been playing since age 12, I read. How did you get interested and, I don't know, enraptured with music?
I don't know how it came, I didn't went to school for that. I didn't, but my ear and try to realize what you are feeling in, according to what you had in your life, according to what you can hear birds singing, what you can hear, any sound, I remember I was young, but I remember, the Woodstock Festival, which was a big light to the world for peace. And I just follow that way.
Now, in 1995, you won the Prix Découverte RFI, which is Radio France International's Discovery Prize.
Yeah.
And then again in 2007, you won another prize, the Indian Ocean Music Award, for your group. So describe your group and what makes your sound so awardable.
The sound is always guiding me, even for the logic of just understanding life, just understanding the way the world, people, world living, war, environment. The sound is my teacher. I always believe on the sound to teach me what I didn't know in school.
Your songs often plea for peace and tolerance, human rights in many forms, and the environment. So what is your latest concern?
I would like, yes, to play music. I'm still composing things, but sometimes I just say, I have say everything. I've sung about love, I've sung about what, I've sung about everything. Then sometimes you feel like there is nothing to say.
Thank you, Malesh. It was a pleasure talking to you. Thanks for joining us on the program Music Time in Africa.
The pleasure was for me, too.
Thanks, Heather, and have a great weekend.